Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to look at one of the absolute highest stakes, most dramatic clashes of constitutional law and corporate power in recent history. We're unpacking a landmark Supreme Court decision regarding the physical and legal battle over the power grid in Iloilo City. This isn't just some dry, boring dispute over contracts. No, this is a literal fight over physical infrastructure, the very limits of government power, and what actually happens when the lights threaten to go out for an entire city.
So that brings us to the core tension we're exploring today. Can a company legally seize a rival's assets? Just imagine this. You've been building a business for nearly a century, only to have the government step in and grant your competitor the power to forcibly take over your physical infrastructure. Is that a necessary act to protect the public, or is it just an unconstitutional corporate takeover masquerading as public welfare?
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the spark, then move to the constitutional questions, the trial court's verdict, the Supreme Court's reversal, the dissenting opinions, and finally wrap up with the evolving public use.
Part 1. The Spark. The end of a 96-year franchise.
All right, so for almost a century, a company called PECO, that's the Panay Electric Company, was the sole power distributor for Iloilo City. PECO's roots go way back to 1921. Fast forward to 1968, and their franchise gets a major extension. But in January 2019, the clock finally ran out. PECO's franchise expired. And then just 1 month later, in February 2019, Congress passed Republic Act 11212, which granted the brand new franchise for the city to a company called More Electric.
Now, this transition is incredibly complex, mostly because of the massive physical scale of the infrastructure at stake here. We're not just talking about a piece of paper changing hands, right? We're talking 5 substations, 450 kilometers of electrical lines, 20,000 poles scattered across a bustling city, 1,300 transformers, and 64,000 meters. PECO owned all of this. More, on the other hand, had the franchise to distribute power, but they had absolutely none of the infrastructure to actually pull it off.
Section 2. The Constitutional Questions. Setting the legal battleground.
First up is a concept you've probably heard of: eminent domain. This is basically the state's inherent power to forcibly acquire private property for public use, as long as they pay just compensation. Now, usually we think of the government using this power to, say, build a new highway or a public school. But here's the kicker. In Republic Act 11-1212, Congress delegated this immense power directly to the new private franchise holder, More Electric. They specifically authorized More to expropriate PECO's existing grid.
The second big concept we need to tackle is the Equal Protection Clause. This is the constitutional guarantee that all persons, or in this case corporations, under similar circumstances, must be treated in the exact same manner by the law. And this right here is the absolute core of PECO's defense. They argue that More was being given a completely unfair, unprecedented advantage over other public utilities. Basically, they felt the law was being weaponized against them.
Section 3. The trial court's verdict. Why the lower court stopped the takeover. So before this ever reached the Supreme Court, PECO launched a massive counterattack in the regional trial court. And guess what? They initially won. The trial court actually struck down Sections 10 and 17 of the law, calling it an unconstitutional legislated corporate takeover. The judge ruled that this expropriation didn't actually serve a genuine public necessity. Instead, they viewed it as an act driven by corporate greed, essentially allowing one company to cannibalize another.
You can really see the fundamental clash of perspectives here. On one hand, the trial court saw a blatantly illegal seizure. They argued you can't just take private property that's already devoted to public use and hand it over to someone else for the exact same use. But on the other hand, the law's explicitly stated intent was all about public necessity. The goal was to bridge the interim transition to ensure the residents of Iloilo didn't suffer through catastrophic, non-stop blackouts.
Section 4. The Supreme Court's reversal, the majority decision.
Now, what's really interesting about this is what happened when the case was elevated. The Supreme Court looked at the exact same set of facts, but the narrative completely flipped. The majority stated that the public necessity of ensuring uninterrupted electricity is implicit in Section 10 of RA number 11212. They didn't just see this as one giant company stealing another's toys. The court impartially recognized that an uninterrupted power supply during a really messy transition isn't just a basic convenience, it's actually a critical matter of public interest and national security.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is what we call the burden space dilemma. Think about it. Payco owns the grid, but they no longer have any legal right to operate it. Moore holds the new franchise and has the legal right to operate, but they completely lack a physical grid. The Supreme Court noted that Iloilo's public spaces, its streets, its sidewalks, they're already burdened by Payco's 20,000 poles. It would be physically impossible, not to mention economically disastrous, for Moore to just go out and build a duplicate grid overnight. Because of that, taking over the existing infrastructure wasn't viewed as a luxury, it was deemed an absolute necessity.
Section 5. The dissenting opinions. The arguments against the takeover.
But hey, the Supreme Court was not unanimous on this. Not at all. To truly understand this explainer, we have to look at the fierce, well-reasoned arguments against the takeover. Justice Leonon broke down the equal protection argument by comparing Moore to other utilities. Look at other electric franchises, like Macat, Tarlac, and Angeles. They have the power of eminent domain, sure, but only Moore was granted the extraordinary power of immediate takeover, the ability to instantly seize the assets. The dissent argued this was clear-cut discrimination, singling out Payco and granting Moore some seriously unwarranted, unique benefits.
There was also an incredibly stark economic argument to consider. Normally, if you're expropriating assets, you have to pay the fair market value up front. It just makes sense, right? But under this specific law, Moore was granted immediate possession merely by depositing the significantly lower assessed value of the properties at a local bank. For the dissenters, they saw this as a really harsh, totally unequal burden placed specifically and squarely on Payco.
Justice Lazaro Javier actually took it a step further. She argued that the law allowed Moore to simply piggyback on Payco's hard work. The dissent was quick to point out that Moore actually had a background in mining, not electricity distribution. From their perspective, this wasn't about public welfare. It was a confiscatory move, basically punishing the legacy operator and handing the keys over to a novice utility without a proper trial of Payco's actual performance. Of course, the majority addressed this head-on. They countered that Mactan and Tarlac are already fully existing systems. Moore, on the other hand, was a brand new franchise holder stepping into a city with a massive grid already in place. The majority argued that Moore simply wasn't similarly situated to those other utilities. Because Moore was uniquely burdened with the terrifying responsibility of preventing citywide blackouts on day one, the court felt that justified the completely unique legislative tools they were handed.
Section 6. The evolving public use. Shifting legal paradigms.
Let's move to our final section and see how this builds into something much bigger. Because beyond Iloilo City, this ruling has massive, sweeping implications for private property everywhere. In a separate opinion, Justice Perlis Bernabe highlighted how the very definition of public use has completely transformed. It used to literally mean actual use by the public, like walking on a public road or playing in a public park. But today, it has acquired an incredibly expansive meaning that includes literally anything bringing usefulness, utility, or advantage to the general public. Which naturally leads us to a fascinating practical conundrum. Think about it. When the state delegates the ultimate power of eminent domain to a private corporation, the line between public benefit and private gain gets incredibly blurry. Yes, absolutely, the public gets their electricity and that's crucial. But at the same time, a private corporation gets to build a massive business empire by legally forcing a rival to sell off its hard-earned assets. Yet the prevailing legal standard that ultimately allowed the Supreme Court to uphold this law is crystal clear. They stated, whatever is beneficially employed for the general welfare satisfies the requirement of public use. Because Moore's takeover of the grid prevented a complete economic disaster and kept the lights on for the end users in Iloilo City, the Supreme Court determined that the general welfare requirement was successfully met, completely regardless of whatever private profits Moore might subsequently earn from the deal.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to take away from today's explainer. As the definition of public use continues to expand to mean general public advantage, where exactly do we draw the line between a genuine public necessity and state-sponsored private profit? It's a huge question, one that goes far, far beyond Iloilo's grid, challenging us all to think about how the law constantly shifts to meet society's evolving needs. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.